The 15th of February, 1942, Singapore. Warrant Officer Class 2nd, Lionel Matthews of the Australian 8th Division Signals watched the Union Jack being lowered. The Gibraltar of the East had fallen. For Matthews, an expert in military communications, the silence following the cacophony of battle was the most unnerving sound. Captured along with 15,000 other Australians, his war of combat was over. But a new, clandestine war was about to begin. As he and his comrades were herded into squalid holding pens, he clutched a deep-seated knowledge of radio technology that the Japanese Imperial Army could not strip from him. They saw a defeated soldier. They had no idea they had just imprisoned a man who would turn their own camp into a secret listening post for the Allied world. The Japanese guards struck with rifle butts, forcing Matthews and hundreds of others into the courtyard of Changi Barracks. Blood ran from a gash above his left eye, where a guard had smashed him for moving too slowly, the iron taste filling his mouth. Around him, Australian soldiers, stripped of weapons and dignity, stood in the equatorial heat. Some had fought for 70 days straight. Now they wore the blank expressions of men who had watched the impossible happen. Singapore was supposed to hold, the fortress impregnable. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival had surrendered the entire garrison to a smaller Japanese force, a humiliation that burned worse than the tropical sun. Matthews pressed his hand against his tunic pocket, where he had hidden a small screwdriver and a length of copper wire. Worthless to most men, they were tools of resistance to a signals expert. Serving with the 8th Division since 1940, he had trained in Malaya and established communication networks across the peninsula. He knew radio frequencies, cipher protocols, and the intricate architecture of military communications. The Japanese did not search thoroughly in those first chaotic hours, too busy reveling in their victory, too confident in their dominance. They missed what Matthews carried in his mind: complete knowledge of Allied radio networks, call signs, and the technical specifications needed to build receivers from salvaged parts. 5 days passed in Changi's overcrowded cells. Matthews watched the Japanese sort prisoners by rank and specialty, looking for engineers and technicians they could exploit. When they discovered Matthews was a warrant officer in signals, they marked him for potential use. On February 20th, guards loaded him and 2,000 other prisoners onto a rusted merchant vessel, the Ubimaru. Destination unknown. The hold reeked of fish and diesel fuel. Men were pressed together so tightly that those who fainted remained upright, held by the crush of bodies. Matthews wedged himself near a dinner plate-sized porthole, through which he watched Singapore's coastline disappear. During 3 days at sea, dysentery spread through the hold. The dead were hauled topside and thrown overboard without ceremony. When the ship docked at Berhala Island on February 23rd, Matthews glimpsed dense jungle and wooden structures near the waterline. Guards forced them into shallow boats. The tide was out, and they waded through mud that sucked at their boots, clinging to their legs. A private beside Matthews collapsed and was left face down in the shallows. No one was permitted to help. On shore, Japanese officers separated prisoners into work groups. Matthews heard the word Sandakan for the first time, barked by a Korean guard who struck a lieutenant with a bamboo cane for not bowing deeply enough. Sandakan, a name that meant nothing yet. Trucks carried them inland along a rutted track through rubber plantations and jungle. After 3 hours, they reached a clearing where wooden watchtowers rose above a barbed wire perimeter. Beyond the wire, Matthews saw the dense green wall of Borneo's rainforest. This was North Borneo, British territory now under Japanese occupation. This was Sandakan Camp, 8 miles from the coastal town of the same name. The camp sprawled across a hillside carved from jungle. Atap huts with thatched roofs stood in rows, separated by concrete drainage ditches already clogged with filth. Matthews and the others were processed through a gate where guards recorded their names and ranks. Captain Hoshijima Susumi, the camp commandant, stood on a platform and addressed them in broken English. The prisoners would build an airfield. They would work until it was complete. Those who refused would be shot. Those who tried to escape would be tortured, then shot, and their families would be notified they died as cowards. A small man with round spectacles that hid his eyes, Hoshijima smiled as he outlined the punishments. Matthews was assigned to Hut 8, a long barracks holding 120 men on wooden sleeping platforms. There were no mattresses, no blankets. The floor was dirt, and flies swarmed through gaps in the atap walls. The latrine, a trench 50 yards away, was already overflowing because the previous work detail had been too weak to dig it deeper. That first night, Matthews lay on the bare wood, listening to men cough, pray, and weep. The Australian next to him, a corporal from the 2 over 19th Battalion, whispered that the camp had been built in January for British officers. Now it was expanding to hold thousands of labourers for the airfield project. North Borneo's strategic position made it valuable for bombing raids on Allied positions to the south. Matthews absorbed this without comment, already thinking about communication, about finding parts, about building something the guards would never suspect. On his second day, Matthews saw the work. Guards marched prisoners 4 miles to a cleared field, where stumps jutted from red earth. The Japanese intended to construct a runway capable of handling bombers. Prisoners would remove stumps, grade the land, and lay crushed rock and concrete. Matthews watched men attack tree roots with blunt axes and broken shovels in the suffocating heat. By mid-morning, prisoners collapsed. Guards beat them until they stood or stopped moving entirely. A lieutenant from the 2 over 29th Battalion fell and did not rise. The guards dragged him to the side of the field and left him in the sun. He died before the midday meal, his body left uncovered as a warning while flies gathered. Matthews was assigned to a technical detail, sorting salvaged materials from abandoned British installations. Here, his signals expertise made him valuable. The Japanese wanted someone who could identify useful components from the wreckage of communications equipment, generators, and vehicles. They did not realize they had given Matthews access to exactly what he needed. In a pile of twisted metal, he found a damaged field, telephone, vacuum tubes, copper wiring, capacitors, and the remains of a British military radio. Matthews worked slowly, visibly cataloguing items for the Japanese sergeant overseeing the detail, making a show of separating valuable items from trash. What the sergeant did not see was the small vacuum tube Matthews slipped into his boot, the coil of antenna wire he wrapped around his waist, or the capacitor he palmed and later buried near a drainage ditch close to Hut 8. Within 2 weeks, Matthews understood the camp's rhythm. Morning tenko at dawn, where prisoners stood for hours while intoxicated or incompetent guards recounted them. Breakfast was a cup of rice porridge, sometimes with weevils. Work details departed at 6, with most men consumed by the airfield project. Matthews remained on the salvage detail 3 days a week, a stroke of fortune he didn't question. The midday meal at the work site was rice, with an occasional scrap of dried fish. Work lasted until 6, followed by evening tenko and a dinner identical to breakfast. Lights out was at 9, though there were no lights, only darkness. Men learned to measure time by guard changes, the calls of jungle birds, and the tropical storms that turned the ground to soup. Matthews also learned the guards. The Japanese officers maintained a cold distance, treating prisoners as industrial resources. The Korean guards, pressed into service by the Japanese Empire, were often more brutal, using bamboo canes to enforce the slightest infractions. Failing to bow deeply enough earned 20 strikes. Speaking without permission earned 50. The Australians called it bashing, a term that failed to capture the sound of bamboo breaking ribs or the sight of men unable to stand afterward. Matthews witnessed a private from the 2/10th Field Company bashed unconscious for making eye contact with a guard. The private never fully recovered, developing a stutter and a tremor in his left hand. Yet within this hell, Matthews saw opportunity. The Japanese assumed their prisoners were defeated and incapable of resistance. Guards posted at the gates and watchtowers grew careless inside the perimeter. Prisoners moved between huts after dark to share food or news, as guards rarely entered the barracks unless they heard loud noises. This created small pockets of freedom that Matthews began to exploit. He recovered the buried capacitor. He fashioned a crude soldering iron from a nail heated in a tin can fire. Using scavenged wire and components stolen piece by piece from the salvage yard, he started assembling a radio receiver in a hollowed-out section of a bamboo support beam in his hut. He worked in absolute darkness, after lights out, his fingers guided by memory and technical training. Other prisoners in Hut 8 knew something was happening but asked no questions. Silence was survival. By March 1942, Sandakan held over 2,000 prisoners, mostly Australians and some British. The death rate climbed from dysentery, malaria, and beriberi. The Japanese provided no medical supplies. The camp's Australian doctor, Captain Cook, operated without anesthesia, using boiled instruments. Matthews saw men die from infected cuts, from tropical ulcers that consumed entire legs, from starvation. The rice rations shrank and protein became a memory. Men's bodies consumed themselves. Ribs showed through skin, eyes sank into skulls. Some stopped speaking, performing their work like automatons until they dropped. Matthews refused to become one of them. The radio project gave him purpose. By April, he had constructed a functional receiver using 7 vacuum tubes, a wire antenna, and a power source, ingeniously adapted from the camp's generator shed. The generator powered lights for the Japanese quarters. Matthews tapped the line during a rainstorm when guards sheltered inside, running a concealed wire to Hut 8. The current was weak, but sufficient. On April 18th, Matthews tuned the receiver to Allied frequencies and heard a voice speaking English, a BBC broadcast from India. The sound was faint and crackling with static, but unmistakable. For the first time since Singapore's fall, he heard news from the outside world. The Japanese were advancing across Burma, Allied forces were retreating but still fighting. The war was not over. Matthews listened for 10 minutes, memorizing every detail, then dismantled the receiver and hid the components. He could not risk longer listening sessions. Discovery meant execution for him and possibly everyone in Hut 8. He shared the information carefully, only with trusted officers like Captain Steele of the 2 over 18th Battalion and Lieutenant Wells of the Signals Corps. They in turn whispered the news to others. Morale shifted. Hollow-eyed men began to talk of liberation, of Allied counteroffensives, of surviving long enough to see victory. It was a fragile hope, built on scraps of information from a contraband radio, but hope nonetheless. Matthews knew the stakes. The Japanese had declared that possessing a radio was a capital offense punishable by firing squad or slow execution. But he also knew information was a weapon, perhaps the only one that mattered in Sandakan's hell. By May 1942, the airfield was taking shape, the runway stretching across the field where men had died clearing stumps. Japanese engineers, supervised as prisoners, worked 12-hour shifts under merciless guards. Matthews continued his dual existence, a compliant prisoner by day, a resistance operative by night. He learned that Allied forces were reorganizing in Australia, that the Japanese advance had stalled in New Guinea, and that the US Navy had engaged the Japanese at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Each broadcast was a lifeline, each piece of information carefully distributed through the camp's underground network. The Japanese suspected nothing, seeing only exhausted prisoners. They did not see the clandestine war waged in the shadows of Hut 8, where a signals expert had turned their camp into a listening post. Matthews knew discovery was inevitable, a more thorough search, a careless word, a prisoner broken by torture, any could reveal his secret. But until that moment came, he would keep listening, keep gathering intelligence, and keep the flame of resistance alive in a place designed to extinguish all hope. The guards believed they controlled Sandakan. They had no idea what Matthews had built beneath their noses. Chapter 2. The Australian signalman Lionel Matthews remembered the sweet air of freedom as he first crossed the barbed wire. But within 48 hours, he understood Sandakan operated on a clock of degradation. Dawn at 0530 brought a shrill whistle, yanking 800 prisoners from their bamboo sleeping platforms. Guards stormed the atap-roofed huts, smashing bamboo rods against anyone too slow to stand. Their Japanese commands were incomprehensible, but the meaning was brutally clear. Matthews forced his weakened legs to move, joining the parade of hollow-eyed men stumbling to roll call. The Tenko yard was a lesson in survival mathematics. Prisoners stood in rows of 10, barefoot in the mud, stripped to ragged shorts under the climbing sun. A Japanese sergeant moved with methodical cruelty, using a bamboo cane to correct posture. When a man swayed from fever, the cane struck his knees. He collapsed. Guards hauled him upright, forcing him to stand through the 30-minute ordeal as the sergeant recounted, deliberately slow, punishing the entire formation for one man's weakness. Matthews locked his knees, kept his eyes forward, and learned the camp's first rule. Individual suffering was collective punishment, a system engineered so prisoners policed each other's survival. Work parties dispersed at 0630. Matthews was assigned to the aerodrome construction detail, a massive project transforming Sandakan's coastline into a military airfield. For 12 hours a day, 200 prisoners marched 3 miles to move earth with improvised tools, bamboo baskets, and blunt shovels that barely penetrated the clay soil. Matthews' hands blistered within the first 3 hours. The blisters burst. Raw flesh gripped the bamboo handles until by midday, blood mixed with the red Borneo earth he carried. Fresh guards rotated in 2-hour shifts, but prisoners worked straight through with only one 10-minute rest. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and were left where they fell until the work party returned to camp, some to revive, others not. On his 3rd day, Matthews saw a guard beat an Australian who stumbled under his load. The beating was administrative. 10 strikes with a bamboo rod, counted aloud in Japanese. The private then pulled himself up and continued working. Stopping meant more beatings or being designated unfit for labor, which meant reduced rations, which meant death by starvation. Evening rice arrived at 1,900. Queuing with a battered mess tin, Matthews received his ration. 6 ounces of rice contaminated with weevils and gravel, occasionally supplemented with a watery vegetable soup that contained more worms than nutrition. "The Japs are feeding us protein whether we like it or not," a British soldier whispered. "The gallows humor necessary for survival." Matthews forced down every grain, chewing slowly to fool his stomach into feeling fuller. He watched other men trade food for cigarettes or salt and mentally marked them as those who wouldn't last. Comfort was a luxury. Food was survival, a distinction that would prove fatal for many within months. By the 3rd week, Matthews had mapped Sandakan's brutal rhythm. Tenko at 0530, work detail until 1900. Evening rice, then lights out at 2100, enforced by beatings for anyone caught moving. He learned the predictable 8-hour guard cycles and began cataloguing faces. Some guards struck reflexively, others only when disobedience demanded it. He noted which ones lingered near the wire, searched huts thoroughly, or could be distracted by obsequiousness. He didn't yet know why he gathered this information, but his survival instinct operated below conscious thought, filing details for future necessity. Disease moved through the camp faster than information. Dysentery hit Matthews in week 4, reducing him to a skeleton squatting over the open pit latrines 20 times a day. These ditches bred flies that carried bacteria back to food, water, and wounds. The smell of human waste became as constant as breathing. Losing 15 pounds in 10 days, his body cannibalizing its own muscle, Matthews still reported for work. Staying in the hut meant no food beyond the base rice ration, while work parties occasionally found fruit in the jungle or could steal vegetables from civilian gardens near the construction site. Lieutenant Rod Wells, a fellow Australian signals officer who had arrived 3 months earlier, became Matthews's first real connection. Meeting in the squalid ablution area, a bamboo structure with a contaminated well, Wells dispensed knowledge Matthews desperately needed: camp patterns, guard personalities, and which Japanese officers could be reasoned with. While scrubbing dysentery filth from his shorts, his voice low, Wells explained the enemy's logic. "The Japanese don't rotate us randomly," he said, wringing brown water from the fabric. "Work details match our service records. They assigned you to aerodrome construction because you're signals. They want us building their communications infrastructure while we build their runway. Watch what you're forced to touch. They're using our expertise against us." This revelation restructured Matthews' understanding. The Japanese weren't simply working prisoners to death, they were extracting military value before that death occurred. Every pole the signals men planted, every wire they strung, made the aerodrome more functional and more dangerous to Allied forces. The brutality had a cold purpose. Sandakan wasn't just extermination, it was exploitation followed by extermination. Captain Hoshijima Susumu ran Sandakan with bureaucratic precision, treating the camp as an industrial operation requiring maximum output from disposable labor. Matthews first encountered him during a camp inspection. Hoshijima walked through the huts with an interpreter, examining sleeping platforms, checking food stores, and questioning prisoners about their health with a facade of concern. Several prisoners raised their hands, asking for medical attention. Hoshijima nodded, made notes, and left. No medical treatment materialized. The inspection was data collection, not humanitarian concern. He was calculating the degradation curve of his labor force, like an engineer assessing equipment lifespan. By the second month, Matthews watched men break in ways more permanent than physical. Private Morrison stopped speaking, his eyes vacant even during beatings. Others developed the shuffle, a gait that signaled complete defeat, shoulders slumped, head down, movements minimal to conserve calories. The shuffle marked men for death within weeks. Guards spotted it too, often bypassing shufflers during beatings because they no longer needed correction. They were already finished. Yet some prisoners adapted with feral ingenuity. Wells showed Matthews how to weave palm fronds into sandals that protected feet on the jungle march. A British corporal, a tailor in civilian life, taught men to repair their rotting shorts using fibre stripped from rice sacks. An Australian private, a former electrical engineer, created makeshift medical tools from scavenged wire and wood, which the camp's overwhelmed doctor used to drain abscesses. These small rebellions against decay, staying mobile, clothed, and infection-free, became more important than grand resistance. Death announced itself casually. Matthews woke one morning to find the man on the platform beside him cold and still, dead from fever. Guards ordered the body removed to the growing cemetery beyond the wire. Matthews felt nothing. 2 months in Sandakan had burned empathy out of him, replacing it with calcified pragmatism. The dead man's blanket became communal property, his mess tin went to another, and his shorts went to the corporal for material. The body itself mattered less than what it left behind. Matthews recognized this absence of feeling as both protection and a warning. When death became logistical rather than tragic, something essential in the human spirit had surrendered. 3 months into captivity, Matthews noticed something that didn't fit Sandakan's pattern of degradation. Civilian workers, Indonesian and Chinese laborers hired by the Japanese, moved through the construction site with relative freedom. These civilians sometimes interacted with prisoners despite guard prohibitions, leaving food nearby or occasionally whispering information. One Chinese laborer made eye contact with Matthews while delivering bamboo poles. The look lasted 3 seconds, but it communicated volumes. "You're not forgotten. Resistance exists outside these wires." That evening, Wells approached Matthews near the latrines. "You saw the Chinese civilian today," Wells said. "Some of them are connected to guerrilla networks in the interior. The Japanese don't know which ones. So they tolerate all of them because they need the labor. He paused, checking for guards. Information flows both ways. Messages can reach the outside. Instructions can reach us. Not quickly, not reliably, but the channel exists. Matthews absorbed this carefully. Communication with the outside meant intelligence could be transmitted, camp conditions, Japanese military movements, and aerodrome progress. And if information could flow outward, perhaps aid could flow inward: equipment, medicine, tangible hope. For the first time, Matthews considered the camp not as a tomb, but as a position behind enemy lines, a place where soldiers might still conduct military operations. The aerodrome work revealed another crucial detail. While forced to assist with installing communications equipment, Matthews began observing not just what he installed, but where. He memorized frequencies on radio equipment and wire routings, identifying which systems controlled what functions. Wells' revelation about external contacts suggested a use for this clandestine knowledge might emerge. The breaking point came 3.5 months into imprisonment. Guards discovered an escape attempt by 2 British prisoners. Recapture took 18 hours. Captain Hoshijima assembled all prisoners for mandatory observation. The beatings, administered with rifle butts and bamboo rods, lasted 30 minutes until both prisoners couldn't stand. Then the guards executed them with bayonets in front of 800 witnesses. Hoshijima's interpreter announced the policy. Attempted escape meant death, not just for escapees, but for randomly selected prisoners from their work detail. Collective punishment was now collective execution. Matthews watched without flinching, his face neutral while rage crystallized in his chest. The executions weren't meant to prevent escape. They were designed to destroy the will to resist, making prisoners police each other through fear. But the strategy contained a flaw. In making escape seem impossible, the Japanese revealed their profound fear of it. They wouldn't kill prisoners for attempting the impossible, they killed them for attempting the achievable. Somewhere in Sandakan's wire and guards, a weakness existed. The question was finding it without triggering the collective punishment that would murder dozens of innocent men. That night, lying on his bamboo platform while rain hammered the atap roof, Matthews made a decision. Physical survival wasn't enough, but neither was passive resistance. Sandakan demanded something more sophisticated. The Japanese had built this camp to extract labor and destroy hope. Matthews would build something inside it that restored purpose and struck back at his captors without them realizing it until too late. The specifics remained unclear, but the determination solidified. He was a signals officer, an expert in communications and coordination. Those skills didn't vanish behind barbed wire. They could be repurposed, transformed into weapons the Japanese wouldn't recognize. The planning would take time and the risks would be extraordinary, but Matthews finally understood his mission in Sandakan. Not to escape, but to make the camp itself into an instrument of resistance. Chapter 3, late 1942, Sandakan Camp. A young private, skeletal and delirious with malaria, died in the arms of his friend, and for Warrant Officer Lionel Matthews, it was the breaking point. He watched as the Japanese propaganda, blared from camp speakers, declared constant Axis victories, crushing the last flickers of hope among the prisoners. Matthews knew it was a lie, but without proof, the lie was as lethal as any disease. He decided then that passivity was a death sentence. He would fight back not with a weapon, but with the one thing the Japanese feared most, the truth. He resolved to build a radio, a secret ear to the outside world, to capture Allied broadcasts and feed his men the truth that would keep them alive. It was an impossible, suicidal task in a camp where being caught with an extra button could mean death. The private, Thompson, was barely 20, and his death wasn't remarkable by Sandakan standards. 3 men died that week, 5 the week before. But Thompson died whispering about a BBC broadcast he'd heard before capture, asking if the Allies were coming. if anyone still fought. His friend, crying over the wasted body, had no answer. Matthews, standing witness, felt something fundamental crack inside him. It wasn't grief anymore. That was too familiar. It was rage, a cold, calculating rage at watching men die in darkness, while loudspeakers shrieked about Japanese invincibility across the Pacific. The guards believed it. Worse, the prisoners were starting to believe it too. Matthews had been a signals officer with the 27th Brigade before capture. He understood radio theory, understood propaganda, and understood exactly what was killing these men beyond disease and starvation. Despair, the systematic murder of hope. He walked away from Thompson's body, with his mind working differently. The camp he had endured for months suddenly looked different, not just a cage anymore, but a battlefield where information was ammunition. Every guard rotation, every work detail, every structural element of Sandakan became data to process. At 42, old for a warrant officer, he was old enough to know that building a radio under Japanese occupation meant torture and execution if discovered. He had watched men beaten unconscious for hiding photographs. The penalty for possessing a receiver would be unspeakable. But Thompson's desperate question echoed. Asterisk. If anyone still fought, asterisk. Matthews decided that question deserved an answer, even if delivering it killed him. The transformation was immediate. So visible he forced himself to slow down, masking the sudden intensity burning through his exhaustion. While other prisoners moved through camp routines mechanically, eyes down and backs bent, Matthews now moved with purpose disguised as submission. He observed everything. The Japanese searched barracks daily but followed patterns. Morning inspections were thorough, evening searches were rushed and careless, focused on counting bodies, not examining shadows. The guards detailed to supervise work parties rotated on a 3-day cycle. Some were brutal and meticulous, others were lazy. Bored teenagers conscripted into occupation duty who daydreamed through their shifts. Matthews memorized which was which. Tuesday mornings meant Sergeant Fukushima, paranoid and vicious, who would notice a misplaced nail. Thursday afternoons meant Private Tanaka, who smoked constantly and watched the jungle instead of the prisoners. These patterns had always existed. Matthews had simply never cared before, focused only on surviving until tomorrow. Now, tomorrow meant something different. It meant intercepting Allied broadcasts. It meant finding evidence that the war continued. It meant keeping 800 men alive by giving them a reason to endure one more day. His pre-war training with the Signals Corps flooded back with painful clarity. A postal clerk before enlisting, he had learned radio operation and maintenance, understanding circuitry and frequency modulation. That knowledge, once useless in the daily struggle against dysentery and beatings, was now a weapon. A clandestine radio needed specific components. Vacuum tubes, variable capacitors, coil wire, crystals for frequency control, a power source. The list seemed impossible inside a prison camp stripped of everything metal, everything useful, everything that might aid resistance. But Matthews started seeing resources where, before he'd seen only deprivation. The camp workshops, where prisoners repaired Japanese equipment under guard, occasionally saw broken radios and communication gear pass through for salvage, their components removed and discarded. The electrical wiring running to the administration buildings, powered by the diesel generator that rattled at the camp's edge. Most critically, the prisoners themselves, 800 men from every trade and background. Someone would have the skills he needed. He began assessing his fellow prisoners with cold calculation, seeing them not as friends anymore, but as potential assets or liabilities. Captain Lionel Richard Stenning, Australian Army Service Corps, had been a mechanical engineer before the war. Matthews had shared latrine duties with him, knowing him as quiet and methodical. Now those qualities meant expertise and discretion. Lieutenant Rod Wells of the Royal Australian Engineers had expertise in electrical systems. Gunner Albert Cleary had worked as a radio technician in civilian life. These men had knowledge. But could they be trusted with a death sentence? Matthews studied them during work details and the twice-daily assemblies. Stenning never flinched during inspections, maintaining absolute control even under interrogation. Wells kept his head down, but Matthews noticed how he observed guard movements, filing information away. Cleary sometimes whispered scraps of remembered news to other prisoners, keeping hope alive in dangerous whispers. These were men still fighting in their own ways, men who had not surrendered internally. The workshops became Matthews' intelligence target. He volunteered for every work detail involving equipment maintenance, subjecting himself to closer guard supervision for the chance to observe what passed through Japanese hands: broken field telephones, damaged transmitters from crashed aircraft, components stripped and dumped in scrap bins. The guards didn't understand the equipment. They knew radios were dangerous, but couldn't distinguish a transformer from a resistor. He memorized what appeared in the scrap, what was discarded versus what was salvaged, calculating what might be stolen without raising suspicion. A single vacuum tube hidden in a pocket meant execution, but a tube thrown in a scrap bin, retrieved during garbage disposal, might go unnoticed. The risk was astronomical, but every day without information meant more prisoners dying hopeless, believing their sacrifice meant nothing. The diesel generator presented both opportunity and danger. It powered the camp's lights, the administration buildings, and the propaganda loudspeakers that tortured them. It also meant electrical current available to anyone clever enough to tap it without detection. During work details, Matthews studied the wiring, noting how thick cables ran from the generator shed to various buildings, sometimes sagging low enough to reach. The insulation was cracked in places from the tropical heat. Accessing power would require stripping wire and creating a concealed connection, all while avoiding electrocution and discovery in darkness as guards patrolled meters away. The technical challenge was enormous. The tactical challenge nearly impossible. But nearly impossible wasn't impossible, and Thompson had died asking if anyone still fought. Matthews began hoarding tiny items with a manic focus disguised as random scavenging. A bent nail from latrine repair, wire scraps from fence maintenance bundled and hidden in the seam of his tattered shorts, a scrap of insulating material peeled from discarded equipment. Each acquisition was meticulously planned. He only took things a guard wouldn't notice missing. He volunteered for the worst details because they provided access to areas and materials. Latrine maintenance meant access to the camp's edge, where discarded materials accumulated. Garbage disposal meant sorting through Japanese refuse, occasionally finding treasures like a damaged cigarette lighter with salvageable parts or broken tools with metal that could be reformed. His reputation shifted. Other prisoners saw him as someone who would take any degrading job for extra food. They didn't understand he was shopping, building an inventory for a project that would get him killed. Time pressure drove him. Men died daily from malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and despair. The Japanese announced increased work quotas on an airfield that would break the prisoners' remaining strength. Matthews understood the mathematics. At current death rates, Sandakan would be a graveyard within a year. The propaganda speakers shrieked about Singapore's fall, Java's surrender, the Philippines crushed, Australia next. Without contrary evidence, the prisoners had no reason to disbelieve. Some were already collaborating, informing on fellow prisoners for privileges. The camp was fragmenting. He had to act before the community's will collapsed completely. He made contact with Stenning first, during a work detail loading timber, amid complaints about the heat. A whispered conversation. Matthews mentioned, carefully, that he had been a signals officer and had seen radio components in the workshop scrap. Stenning's eyes sharpened immediately. No words were needed. A glance confirmed his understanding. 2 days later, Stenning maneuvered close during morning assembly and whispered that Wells had electrical experience and Cleary still remembered radio frequencies. 3 names. 3 potential accomplices. Matthews studied each man for another week, watching for any hint of weakness or connection to informers. He found nothing suspicious. More critically, he saw the same cold determination he felt. These were men who were done enduring passively, waiting for a chance to resist. The commitment crystallized on November 15th, 1942. After 6 months of captivity and 200 prisoners dead, Matthews stood at evening assembly and understood with absolute clarity that he was deciding how he would die. Building a radio meant probable execution. Not building it meant watching everyone die slowly, himself included, in darkness and ignorance. The choice wasn't between life and death. It was between dying a victim or dying a combatant, between surrender and resistance. He thought briefly of his wife and the son he'd never met, born 2 months after his deployment. They deserved to know he had fought until the end, that he hadn't simply waited for death. That night, he approached Stenning directly, whispering in the darkness of the barracks, radio, components, risk, death sentence. Stenning didn't hesitate. He was in. Wells joined them, then Cleary. 4 men committed to an insane project. They would build a receiver from scavenged parts. They would tap the camp's electrical system for power. They would intercept Allied broadcasts, BBC or Australian stations, and transcribe the truth, feeding accurate information through the prisoner network. They would give 800 dying men a reason to fight for something beyond tomorrow's rice ration. The plan was forming, detailed, and desperate. Matthews felt purpose burning through the malaria fever and starvation. He would fight back. The Japanese had taken everything else. They would not take the truth. Chapter 4. Early 1943, Sandakan Camp. Under the watch of the guards, the work began. Warrant Officer Lionel Matthews, a master of improvisation, started orchestrating a complex smuggling and construction operation. Every work party sent into Sandakan town was a mission, smuggling a stolen spark plug, a bartered capacitor, a length of wire hidden in a hollow bamboo pole. Each piece was a monumental victory. Working with a small, trusted team that included Captain Hoshijima, a Japanese engineer sympathetic to their plight, Matthews began assembling the components in a secret compartment. At night, huddled under a blanket while others stood watch, he meticulously soldered and wired, creating a functioning radio receiver from junk and smuggled parts. By mid-1943, a faint, crackling voice cut through the static. The BBC. Hope had a voice again. But having the radio was only the beginning. Matthews understood its true value lay not just in hearing Allied broadcasts, but in sharing that information. The real plan, the dangerous expansion that would either save lives or guarantee his execution, required transforming individual hope into organized resistance. Matthews needed more than listeners. His first recruit was obvious. Lieutenant Rod Wells, Australian Army Signals, who possessed the technical knowledge to operate and maintain the receiver. During a work detail in the camp vegetable garden, guards 60 meters distant, Matthews approached without preamble. "Can you remember Morse code?" Wells's hands never stopped working the red earth. 3 seconds of silence. Every letter. Matthews nodded once. The conversation ended. 2 days later, Wells received the location of the hidden compartment through a whispered sentence during rice distribution. The second recruitment carried more risk. Captain Lionel Outram, a British officer, had contacts with local Chinese and Filipino resistance operatives outside the wire, something Matthews desperately needed. But Outram was also unpredictable, prone to reckless gestures that drew guard attention. Matthews watched him for a week, calculating that Outram's network was invaluable, but if compromised, the entire operation would die. The approach came during a night latrine trip. In 2 minutes of darkness, as guards changed shift, I have information worth trading. Outram understood immediately. How current? Matthews let silence confirm. Outram's eyes narrowed. I'm in. The third recruit was Japanese. Captain Susumi Hoshijima, the camp engineer, occupied an impossible position. Officially responsible for maintaining camp infrastructure, Hoshijima had quietly demonstrated sympathies that could cost him his life. A blind eye to stolen tools, diverted medical supplies, and warnings about surprise inspections. Matthews had observed him for months before trusting him with the radio project. Now, Hoshijima became critical, able to move through the camp without suspicion and access guard schedules. Each interaction deepened his betrayal. During a supposed inspection of barrack foundations, Matthews offered him an out. "This will get bigger, more dangerous. You can walk away now." Hoshijima's response was quiet. "Allied victory serves Japan better than this madness." Continue. The network required structure. Matthews established a system where the radio operated twice weekly after midnight. Wells handled reception and transcription. Matthews analyzed intelligence and determined distribution. Outram passed critical information to resistance contacts, while Hoshijima provided security, warning of guard movements and Kempeitai visits. To move information inside the camp, Matthews developed a coded language based on cricket scores and Australian place names, meaningless to Japanese ears but packed with intelligence for informed listeners. A casual conversation about Melbourne's performance might contain Allied advancement information. The codes were distributed verbally, never written, always deniable. The first close call arrived 6 weeks into operations. A cruel Korean guard, Takahashi, noticed increased nighttime movement in Matthews's barrack. Matthews detected the surveillance and knew the danger was immediate. A single inspection at the wrong moment meant mass executions. He made a decision. The radio had to go silent. For 2 weeks of blackout, prisoners who had begun to hope now faced silence, some suspecting betrayal. Wells argued for continuing, but Matthews refused. "One interception, and we all hang. We wait." 12 days in, Hoshijima provided the solution. Takahashi's ambition was exploited. A minor infraction was reported to senior guards with subtle evidence pointing toward Takahashi's own pilfering. The ambitious guard found himself transferred to perimeter duty, his reputation damaged. The path was clear. Operations resumed with added security, a new lookout rotation, and emergency concealment procedures. The radio was moved to a hollowed space beneath the shower block foundation, its location known only to Matthews and Wells. As 1943 progressed, the intelligence became more valuable. Allied victories suggested liberation, but also increased Japanese paranoia. The camp swelled with new prisoners, and starvation and disease accelerated. The network became a practical lifeline, using news of Allied bombing patterns to anticipate supply disruptions. By October 1943, the network had expanded to 19 officers, each receiving tailored information. The system worked because Matthews controlled distribution tightly. Only he, Wells, and Hoshijima understood the full scope. The psychological weight was crushing. Discovery meant not just his own death, but the execution of everyone involved, possibly the entire camp. The physical toll compounded the mental strain. Malnutrition made Matthews's hands shake, dysentery left him weak, and tropical ulcers ate at his legs. Yet the work continued. Wells took over more technical operations. Outram expanded external contacts, and Hoshijima risked more to secure supplies and maintain cover. In December 1943, a second crisis emerged. A British prisoner, suffering a mental breakdown, began speaking openly about secret intelligence and radio messages from London. Though mostly dismissed as delirium, a Japanese interpreter overheard and reported it to the Kempeitai. An investigation began. Hoshijima gave Matthews 72 hours warning. The radio had to be dismantled. The decision was paralyzing. Destroy it and lose the intelligence advantage, or hide it and risk mass execution. Assembling his core team, Matthews made the call for partial dismantling. The receiver was broken into components and hidden separately, with the most incriminating parts buried outside the wire. The Kempeitai investigation lasted 9 days. With searches and interrogations, The prisoner who sparked the crisis died during questioning, his ravings now attributable to mental collapse. The investigation found nothing. By January 1944, Matthews faced a new calculation. Allied advances suggested liberation was possible, but Japanese desperation grew and camp conditions worsened deliberately. Matthews chose to continue. He reassembled the radio in a new location, a false bottom in the sick bay's medical supply cabinet, and modified operations, reducing transmission frequency and tightening distribution. The plan's final element began taking shape in February 1944. The network needed to enable action. Matthews began coordinating with Outram's contacts to establish supply lines for medicine, food, and potential weapons, transforming the intelligence network into a resistance organization. This required recruiting enlisted men with specific skills: sappers, medics, mechanics. The network grew to 37 men by March, each knowing only their part. But Matthews's physical condition was collapsing from beriberi and malaria. He refused to step back, believing his disciplined caution kept everyone alive. In April 1944, the Kempeitai returned, this time establishing a permanent substation to monitor prisoners. The intelligence operation faced extinction. The network went into hibernation. Radio operations ceased. For 6 weeks, silence descended again, and the camp's mood spiraled. Matthews used the time to plan the final phase, a dormant resistance cell, activated only when liberation was imminent or escape necessary. In June 1944, Hoshijima brought intelligence that changed everything. The Japanese command was planning mass prisoner evacuations from Sandakan death marches into the interior, a deliberate extermination. The timeline was weeks, maybe months. Matthews activated the network, not for intelligence, but for survival. Escape routes were planned with external contacts. The sick and weak would be left behind, but some could survive. The radio was reassembled one last time to monitor Allied advancements and time the escapes precisely. Matthews began the brutal selection process, identifying 30 men as escape candidates based on physical capability and skills. In August, before the plan could execute, the Kempeitai discovered supply caches hidden outside the wire. They knew organized resistance existed. Torture began within hours. Hoshijima brought a final warning. They know. Not everything, but enough. Run or destroy it all. Matthews chose action. That night, the 11th of August 1944, he gathered his core team. After a final radio reception to confirm Allied positions, he methodically destroyed what he'd built. The receiver was smashed, documents burned, and contact names committed to memory. The escape network, however, remained intact. The 30 identified men received activation orders. On the 13th of August 1944, the Kempeitai arrested Warrant Officer Lionel Matthews for espionage. The charges confirmed someone had talked but revealed incomplete information. He was transferred to Kempeitai headquarters for interrogation. Wells, Outram, and Hoshijima remained undetected, protected by the network's compartmentalized structure. Matthews endured 6 weeks of systematic torture. He admitted building a radio but revealed nothing about the network, the escapees, or his contacts. He gave them himself and the radio, but kept everything else. In September, a military tribunal convicted him of espionage and sentenced him to death. In Sandakan, Wells and Outram continued the work. When the death marches began in January 1945, the escape plan activated. Men slipped away at designated points, following the routes Matthews had mapped. 6 Australian prisoners successfully escaped, carried to Allied lines by Filipino resistance fighters. Captain Susumi Hoshijima disappeared in the chaos of war's end, his role never officially acknowledged. Lieutenant Rod Wells survived the march, was liberated weighing 38 kilograms, and carried Matthews's story. Captain Lionel Outram died on the second march, his contacts enabling escapes he never saw. On the 2nd of March 1945, Warrant Officer Lionel Matthews faced a firing squad. He refused the blindfold. Standing there, hands bound, he knew the secret the Japanese never discovered. The radio was a tool. The intelligence was valuable. But the network of trust, courage, and coordinated resistance he had created was the real weapon. That would outlive him. The volley echoed across Sandakan. Lionel Matthews fell. The network survived. 30 years later, investigators discovered the truth. Matthews had built more than a radio. He had built hope with wire and determination, broadcast in whispers to men who desperately needed to believe they were not forgotten. Chapter 5. The Kempeitai strikes without warning at Sandakan camp, a sudden, brutal intrusion into the monotonous misery of prisoner life. Warrant Officer Lionel Matthews stands in the shimmering center of the compound's brutal afternoon sun, a heat that cooks the very air and bakes the packed earth. His hands are bound tightly behind his back with telephone wire that cuts so deep into his swollen wrists it seems to kiss the bone. Sticky rivulets of blood run down his face from where heavy rifle butts opened his scalp, matting his hair and blurring his vision. Around him, 800 skeletal prisoners watch in a stunned, forced silence, their gaunt faces a mixture of terror and grim resignation. The Kempeitai officers, immaculate in their starched uniforms, circle him like predators, closing in on their prey, their movements deliberate and full of menace. Captain Susumi Hoshijima, the camp commandant, stands rigid and apart, a statue of impotent fury. His authority has been utterly superseded by these secret police operatives who answer only to the highest echelons in Tokyo, and his humiliation is as public as Matthews's suffering. At Matthews's feet, the dismantled radio lies in sad, scattered pieces, delicate vacuum tubes shattered, a web of wiring savagely torn apart, the hand-carved wooden casing splintered into kindling. For 18 long months, this clandestine device had been a lifeline, a flickering candle of hope in an endless night, bringing whispers of Allied advances, news from home, and the defiant voice of the BBC. Now it becomes irrefutable evidence of sabotage, espionage, and criminal contact with the enemy. The Kempeitai major, a thin, ascetic man whose perfectly pressed uniform contrasts grotesquely with the filth and decay around him, circles Matthews slowly, methodically. His polished leather boots click against the hard, packed ground with unnerving rhythm. He speaks no English, delivering his orders through a terrified interpreter whose voice trembles with each translated threat. The ultimatum is absolute. Every prisoner connected to the intelligence network will be identified. Every civilian contact outside the wire will be named. Every source of parts, every smuggled battery, every coded message, the Kempeitai will extract complete knowledge of this entire operation. Matthew's jaw is set, his eyes fixed on some distant point. He says nothing. Captain Rod Wells stands beside him, his face a swollen mask from his own initial interrogation. Keith Botterill, the young signalman whose nimble fingers assembled the radio in total darkness, spits a gob of blood onto the dusty ground. Wang Hin, the courageous Chinese merchant who had smuggled in the most critical components, shows no expression, a mask of stoicism despite the agony of broken ribs. They all know what comes next. The Kempeitai major gives a subtle, almost imperceptible signal. Instantly, 2 guards grab Matthews, their grips like iron clamps, and drag him toward the commandant's office, now converted into a sterile and efficient interrogation center. The other prisoners are forced violently to their knees, their heads bowed, made to witness the beginning of what military intelligence will later classify as systematic, scientific torture. Matthews disappears into the building. Within minutes, the first raw screams echo across the compound, cutting through the enforced stillness, a sound that shreds the soul. The Kempeitai employs methods perfected and refined in occupied territories across Southeast Asia. They are masters of their horrific craft, water torture that simulates drowning, electric shocks from a hand-crank generator, and systematic rhythmic beatings focused on the kidneys, joints, and soles of the feet to maximize pain while preventing a mercifully immediate death. Information must be extracted, networks must be utterly destroyed, and terrifying examples must be made. Hour after hour, the interrogation grinds on. When Matthews inevitably loses consciousness from the pain, they revive him with buckets of cold water and begin again. The questions, delivered in the interpreter's monotonous, fearful drone, never vary. Who helped you build the radio? Which guards can be bribed? What specific intelligence was transmitted to Allied forces? Where are the other hidden radios? Matthews gives them nothing, clinging to a core of unshakable resolve. His silence is not just defiance, it is a weapon. It purchases precious time for his contacts outside the wire to flee, burn documents, or hide evidence. Every hour he resists might mean another civilian life, another family, escapes the Kempeitai's rapacious reach. Every non-answer protects prisoners who smuggled small parts or passed messages, but whose exact roles remain blessedly unknown to the interrogators. By nightfall, they carry his unconscious, broken body back to the punishment cells, primitive bamboo cages barely large enough to crouch in, set in the direct, blistering sun during the day, and exposed to chilling rain at night. The Kempeitai works methodically through the known members of the network. Captain Wells is next, then Botterill. Each man's interrogation lasts for hours, a torment punctuated only by silence or screams. The entire camp transforms into a landscape of palpable terror. All work details cease. Prisoners are forced to kneel in formation from dawn until the last light fades, a silent, suffering sea of men, forbidden to move, speak, or look away from the punishment area. The guards who had previously accepted bribes simply disappear, transferred, or executed. No one knows for sure. The Korean guards, many of whom had been sympathetic, become brutal enforcers overnight, terrified that their own minor acts of complicity might be exposed. On the third day, the Kempeitai expands its operations beyond the wire. Wang Hin's shop in Sandakan town is raided at dawn. They find nothing his network had given him, just enough hours to remove every trace of incriminating evidence. But his family provides the leverage they need. His wife and 2 young daughters are brought to the camp, placed in nearby cells, clearly within view of his cage. The interrogator offers brutally simple terms: the names of all Chinese merchants who aided the network, or he will watch his family suffer and die first. Wang Hin breaks. It is not a complete collapse, but it is enough. He provides 3 names. 2 merchants he knows have already fled deep into the jungle, and 1 who has been dead for 6 months. The Kempeitai, needing a victory, accepts this partial truth. They search the mentioned shops and find genuine evidence of smuggling in one of the abandoned buildings. They execute Wang Hin's family anyway, a calculated lesson in the absolute price of resistance. His daughters die first, then his wife, all 3 shot in the compound at noon as the entire prisoner population is forced to watch. Wang Hin is then dragged back to his cage to continue living with that knowledge. The intelligence network had reached far beyond Sandakan into the local native communities. Suluk fishermen had smuggled medicine and radio parts by boat. Malay plantation workers passed messages along their routes. Chinese merchants provided batteries, wire, and food. Now, the Kempeitai sweeps through these communities like a scythe through dry grass. In the coastal village of Berhala, 3 fishermen who supplied the camp are publicly beheaded on the beach. In the rubber plantations outside town, 2 workers accused of carrying messages are tortured for information, then buried alive. The terror radiates outward from Sandakan camp, transforming the entire region. Civilians who once risked their lives to help prisoners now flee into the interior or disavow all knowledge, their compassion extinguished by fear. The fragile, clandestine network of resistance collapses. By the end of the first week, 17 prisoners are held in the punishment cells, their bodies broken. 37 civilians are imprisoned in the Sandakan town jail. Yet Matthews holds out the longest. Under sustained torture, disoriented from excruciating pain and sleep deprivation, he begins to provide scattered, carefully chosen information, just enough to satisfy his interrogators that he is cooperating, but little enough to protect the most critical contacts. He confirms what they already know, admits to receiving BBC broadcasts, acknowledges the smuggling of medicine, but never reveals operational details that could destroy the few remaining underground channels. The psychological torture proves as destructive as the physical. The Kempeitai brings Matthews and Wells before the assembled prisoners repeatedly, displaying their deteriorating condition as a terrible warning. They are emaciated, skeletal figures, barely recognizable, covered in bruises and burns, unable to stand without the support of their guards. The message is brutally clear. This is what resistance earns. It brings only suffering and death. Yet even in this devastation, Matthews achieves one critical objective. By focusing his limited confessions entirely on the radio, he convinces the Kempeitai that they have destroyed the only intelligence operation in Sandakan. They believe the network was isolated and now annihilated. They do not discover the buried notebooks documenting guard routines. They do not find the concealed maps showing camp defenses. They do not learn about the coded messages still being passed through certain trusted work details. Matthews protects these vital continuing operations by sacrificing himself and the radio network, making the interrogators believe they had won a total victory. The interrogations extend into August. Dr. Taylor, who treated sick prisoners with smuggled medicine, endures days of beatings but reveals nothing about his civilian sources. Lieutenant Oakeshott, suspected of helping encode messages, maintains complete denial despite losing 3 fingers to a pair of pliers. The British and Australian officers face a stark, calculated choice. Full cooperation might save their individual lives, but would expose hundreds of civilians and destroy any remaining resistance. Complete silence guarantees a horrific death, but protects others. Most choose silence. The casualty list grows. By mid-August, 5 prisoners have died during interrogation. 12 civilians are executed in Sandakan town. The Kempeitai considers the operation a resounding success. They prepare final dispositions for the ringleaders. Matthews, Wells, Botterill, and 5 others are to be transferred to the military prison in Kuching for a formal trial on espionage charges, a show trial to demonstrate Japanese justice. But the war is turning against them. Allied advances in the Pacific accelerate, and by late August, American forces land in the Philippines. The Kempeitai shifts its priorities from interrogation to military security. On the 1st of September 1944, without trial or formal charges, the Kempeitai executes the network's leaders. Matthews, Wells, Botterill, Oakeshott, and 4 others are taken to a clearing 3 miles from camp. They are forced to dig their own graves in the sticky red Borneo soil. Each man is shot in the back of the head and buried in the shallow pit. No markers. No records. Simply disappeared. Wang Hin and 2 other Chinese civilians are executed the same day in Sandakan town square. At the camp, the Kempeitai posts new regulations. Any contact with civilians means death for both. Any suspected intelligence activity will trigger mass punishment. The guards, terrified, enforce these rules with paranoid brutality. Hope itself becomes contraband. Yet the intelligence gathered and transmitted reaches Allied command. The maps, the guard strengths, the defensive positions, this information influences the planning for Borneo's liberation. And the Kempeitai does not know that before his execution, Matthews passed one final message through a sympathetic guard, a Korean conscript who despised his Japanese overseers. The message reaches Australian intelligence in early 1945. It contains patrol patterns, the Japanese order of battle, and confirmation that Sandakan holds over 2,000 prisoners whose condition requires urgent liberation. This information, purchased with torture and death, proves Matthews understood the true mathematics of war. In September 1944, Sandakan camp enters a brutal autumn. The Kempeitai withdraws, satisfied. Captain Hoshijima resumes command of a terrorized, traumatized population. The prisoners face increasing starvation as Japanese military reversals cut off supply lines. Death now comes not from execution, but from systematic starvation and disease. Matthews dies, never knowing if his intelligence reached its destination or whether the sacrifice of his network changed anything beyond the wire. He dies believing that resistance itself justifies the cost, that maintaining humanity under inhumane conditions constitutes its own victory, regardless of outcome. The Kempeitai's horrific retribution achieves its goal. No radio operates in Sandakan again, but it cannot erase the example he established. In the camp's final, terrible months, prisoners remember the radio, the intelligence network, and the fact that resistance remained possible even when survival seemed impossible. Chapter 1. Extraction failed. Check Gemini output structure. The 6 men who stumbled out of the Borneo jungle in September 1945 carried more than their emaciated bodies. They carried names. In the chaos of liberation, as Australian forces reached what remained of Sandakan camp, they found an abandoned horror. Of the 2,434 prisoners who entered, only 6 Australians walked out alive. The camp records were ashes. The Japanese had burned everything before fleeing. Without survivors who remembered, without documentation, the deaths at Sandakan might have become mere statistics, numbers in a ledger. But those 6 men remembered Lionel Matthews. They remembered the radio, and they remembered what happened when the Japanese discovered it. The Australian War Crimes Commission began taking testimonies in October 1945. Private Keith Botterill, barely 90 pounds with legs permanently damaged from forced marches, spoke Matthews's name for the first time since watching him die. Botterill described the hidden radio network, the intelligence passed to guerrillas, and the coordination Matthews maintained even as starvation claimed men daily. He depicted the March 1945 discovery, the brutal interrogations, and the beatings that rendered Matthews's face unrecognizable. He recounted Matthews standing at attention before Captain Susumi Hoshijima, refusing to name a single prisoner who had helped him. Botterill's testimony filled 43 pages, becoming Prosecution Exhibit 47 at the War Crimes Tribunals in Rabaul. Gunner Owen Campbell corroborated every detail. So did Private Nelson Short, Bombardier Bill Moxham, Private Dick Braithwaite, and Warrant Officer Bill Stickpowich. 6 men provided 6 identical accounts of Matthews's resistance network and his execution. Their testimonies meticulously reconstructed what the Japanese tried to burn. A documented record of Matthews gathering intelligence on Japanese troop movements, ship schedules, and supply routes, then passing it to Allied command through local operatives. The intelligence had tangible value. Radio intercepts later confirmed that Matthews's reports reached Australian forces in Morotai and influenced operational planning in early 1945. His information identified Japanese defensive positions around Sandakan, marked by Allied planners for bombardment. The invasion never came. MacArthur bypassed Borneo, but Matthews couldn't have known that. He gathered intelligence because resistance was duty. The Australian government moved quickly. By March 1947, Matthews's widow, Lorna, received notification that her husband would be posthumously awarded the George Cross. The citation lauded his cold-blooded courage in the face of continued danger and detailed his refusal to betray fellow prisoners despite torture. At the ceremony in Melbourne on the 21st of October 1947, Lorna Matthews stood beside their 3 young children. The Governor-General pinned the George Cross to a velvet cushion as the newspapers ran the story. The Australian public, still processing the horrors of Japanese captivity, embraced Matthews as a hero. For 3 weeks, his story appeared in every major paper. Then it faded. The problem was classification. The intelligence Matthews gathered remained secret. His methods, radio construction, the operative network, encryption techniques, were the very details that would have made his story compelling, but they were precisely what the military could not release. His debriefing notes, compiled from survivor testimony, were filed at Victoria Barracks in Melbourne and stamped with classification markings that wouldn't be lifted for 30 years. The public knew Matthews won the George Cross for bravery. They didn't know what, specifically, he had done. The citations were deliberately vague, with phrases like intelligence gathering and resistance leadership, sounding heroic but revealing nothing operational. Meanwhile, the 6 survivors struggled. Keith Botterill tried talking about Sandakan once at a pub in 1948 and watched his listeners' faces go blank. The details were too horrific. Australians wanted to move forward, not dwell on atrocities. Botterill stopped talking. So did the others. By 1950, the 6 Sandakan survivors had largely withdrawn from public view. They attended Anzac Day ceremonies but gave no speeches. Matthews's story survived in military circles. The Australian Army's intelligence branch maintained his file as a case study in POW resistance, his techniques appearing in classified training materials for interrogation resistance courses developed in the 1,950 seconds. But this institutional memory remained behind security barriers, inaccessible to the public, and even Matthews's own family. For 2 decades, his George Cross sat in a display case at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, where visitors learned he had been brave, but not how or why. The forgetting deepened as other narratives, like the Thai-Burma Railway with its greater number of survivors and testimonies, came to define Australia's POW story. Sandakan produced silence. Then the classifications started expiring. In 1975, a researcher named Lynette Silver requested access to the War Crimes Tribunal files for her doctoral thesis. The National Archives released them, and Silver found the testimonies. She found descriptions of Matthews's radio, his intelligence network, and the specific information he had gathered. She unearthed Bill Stickwich's 48-page account, written in 1946 and untouched for nearly 30 years. Silver spent 3 years tracking down the surviving witnesses. 4 of the 6 were still alive in 1978. Keith Botterill, now in his 60s, spoke to her, sharing details he had never revealed publicly: the radio's construction from stolen parts, the code Matthews used, the guerrilla operative who received the intelligence drops. Botterill showed her a sketch he had made in 1946 of the radio's hiding place inside a false-bottomed water canteen. Silver's book, Sandakan, A Conspiracy of Silence, was published in 1998. It was the first comprehensive account of Matthews's resistance network based on declassified materials. The book won the Walkley Award and became required reading at the Australian Defence Force Academy. For the first time, the public could understand exactly what Matthews had built, how it worked, and why it mattered. The conspiracy of silence, institutional, personal, and bureaucratic, had finally broken. Silver's research triggered a cascade of recognition. The Australian War Memorial expanded Matthews's exhibit. The Army's School of Military Intelligence added his case to their curriculum, and in 2001, Adelaide, his birthplace, named a street after him. The modern military connection is direct. At the Australian Defence Force School of Signals, instructors teaching improvised communications reference Matthews's radio. The technical details, how he built a functional receiver from a damaged Japanese radio, scavenged wire, and a crudely charged battery, appear in training materials for signals personnel. His methods for hiding the radio inform counterintelligence training. The lesson isn't abstract inspiration, it's practical tradecraft extracted from documented success. The Australian Army's interrogation resistance course taught at the Special Air Service Regiment headquarters, uses Matthews's case as a template for compliance under the Code of Conduct. Instructors walk students through his interrogation timeline, the 18 days between discovery and execution, the documented beatings, and the accounts of what Captain Hoshijima demanded and what Matthews refused to provide. The training emphasizes Matthews's specific technique. He provided useless information slowly, buying time. His resistance prevented the Japanese from identifying the guerrilla operatives or Allied contacts. Those networks survived because Matthews died without talking. At the Australian War Memorial, Matthews's George Cross is displayed alongside radio components Keith Botterill donated in 1986, fragments of the actual device, recovered from the camp ruins and preserved by local civilians. The display includes Botterill's sketch and declassified intelligence summaries. The George Cross itself represents something specific in Australian military culture. Unlike the Victoria Cross for combat valor, it recognizes courage where fighting back means certain death, but compliance means betrayal. Matthews couldn't fight his way out, he could only refuse. The George Cross acknowledges that refusal maintaining duty when cooperation would have saved his life as the highest form of military courage. This is why his story appears in leadership courses, not just as inspiration, but as doctrine. Lionel Matthews died on the 2nd of March 1944. He was 36. The Japanese buried him in an unmarked grave, and his remains were never individually identified. His name is carved on the Labuan Memorial in Borneo, alongside thousands of others with no known grave. Every June, the Australian Defence Force attaché in Malaysia lays a wreath there. In 2019, the Royal Australian Signals Corps designated March 2 as Matthews Day. Signals units hold remembrance ceremonies and demonstrate improvised radio construction. The training is practical. The Australian Army learned from Sandakan that teaching soldiers why to resist isn't enough. You have to teach them how. His family preserved what little they had. Lorna Matthews kept his letters and photographs, which were later donated to the Australian War Memorial. The collection is small but contains his handwriting, his voice in letters to his wife, evidence of the man he was before Sandakan made him a symbol, a man who loved cricket, worried about money, and wrote terrible poetry to make his wife laugh. The Sandakan Memorial Park now stands where the camp existed. A small museum houses artifacts, fragments of wire, a water canteen, and a Japanese document ordering prisoners to reveal illegal wireless activities or face execution, dated 2 weeks before Matthews died. What remains is this: a name on a memorial, a medal in a museum, and a lesson in a classroom. Matthews's intelligence didn't change the war's outcome. His network was discovered, and his life ended in an unmarked grave. But the 6 men who survived carried his name out of that place. They testified, preserving the story when silence would have been easier. Keith Botterill, asked in 1989 why he kept talking about Sandakan when the memories caused such pain, said simply, "Someone should know he didn't beg. That is what remains." Not the intelligence he gathered, nor the radio itself, but the refusal. Lionel Matthews stood before his executioner and refused to beg. The 6 survivors made certain that refusal outlived him.